The letter arrived on a wind that felt like it was made of broken glass. It sliced through Clara Whitmore's wool coat and right into her bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. Standing on the train platform at Copper Creek Station, the paper in her hand was more than a job offer. It was a lifeline. And a lie. The advertisement was simple enough. A widowed rancher needed a capable woman. Someone to manage a household, assist with the land, help with a young daughter. 3 months of careful letters, of questions asked and answers carefully crafted, had led her here. To this endless sea of white snow under a bruised purple sky. But it wasn't the cold that made her tremble as the stagecoach vanished into the storm. It was the secret she carried, heavy as a gravestone. The man waiting for her, Thomas Brennan, had no idea his new housekeeper wasn't a housekeeper at all. He had no idea she was Dr. Clara Whitmore, former head of agricultural sciences at the Colorado Women's College, and he certainly had no idea she was running from a scandal so toxic it could not only destroy her, but drag him and his little girl down with her. The lie was her shield, but she was beginning to fear it might also become her cage. The Brennan Ranch house rose from the blizzard like the ghost of a great ship, its windows burning a defiant amber against the fury of the storm. Clara watched it grow closer from the sleigh, the sight of it catching the air in her lungs. It was a sprawling, powerful structure of timber and stone, tucked into a valley that should have been a sanctuary. Even through the swirling snow, she could see the intelligence behind its design. The barn was angled perfectly to break the brutal northwest winds. A root cellar was dug deep into the safety of the hillside. A line of pines stood like silent soldiers, a windbreak that spoke of a builder who knew this land, who understood its cruelty and its beauty. "That's the Brennan place," the driver shouted over the wind. And there, in the doorway, was a silhouette. A tall man, backlit by the warmth of the home, his very presence a challenge to the storm. As the sleigh slid to a halt, the details sharpened. Broad shoulders under a simple wool shirt, dark hair already surrendering to silver at the temples, and eyes the color of a thunderhead, holding a weariness that seemed older than the man himself. He stood straight, but it was the posture of a man carrying an invisible, crushing weight. An unexpected wave of sympathy tightened Clara's chest. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was deeper than his letters suggested, a low rumble more suited to calming horses than making small talk. "I'm Thomas Brennan. Welcome to Copper Creek." He offered a hand to help her down. His fingers were calloused and strong, but his grip was surprisingly gentle. "Mr. Brennan, thank you for meeting me." "Couldn't leave you to the wolves," he said, his gaze sweeping over her. It wasn't judgmental, just assessing. He took in her practical dress, her sturdy boots. She thought she saw a flicker of approval. "Storm's getting worse. Let's get you inside." The house was a fortress of warmth and quiet dignity. Polished wood floors were softened by colorful rugs. A stone fireplace, big enough to hold a man, crackled with life, and shelves, so many shelves, were packed tight with books. But Clara's attention was snagged by a small shape curled in a massive armchair by the fire. A little girl trying to make herself invisible. "Emma," Thomas said, his voice softening just a fraction. "Come meet Miss Whitmore." The girl who unfolded herself was maybe 10, a tiny echo of her father. Same dark hair, same stormy eyes, but hers were filled with a caution that didn't belong in a child's face. Her dress was clean but patched, her hair braided with a clumsiness that spoke of a man's hands doing a woman's work. Clara immediately knelt, bringing herself down to the girl's level. The small movement seemed to startle them both. "Hello, Emma. I'm Clara. Your father tells me you're quite the horsewoman." Emma's eyes darted to her father, seeking permission, then back to Clara. "I can ride Buttercup all by myself," she whispered. "Papa says I'm almost ready for Thunder." Clara raised an eyebrow, a playful spark in her eyes. Thunder? That sounds like a horse with a story. He's not mean, Emma said, a little defensively, taking a small step closer. He just has spirit. Mama used to say spirit isn't something to break, just something to understand. A heavy silence fell, thick with the ghost of the woman who had said those words. Thomas cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Emma, why don't you show Miss Whitmore to her room? I'll bring her bags. The climb up the stairs was a tour through a life frozen in time. Emma chattered about the layout of the house, but Clara saw the real story in the things left unsaid. A woman's shawl was still draped over a reading chair, as if she had just stepped away. A collection of family photographs on the mantel were all turned to face the wall. The house was clean, meticulously so, but it felt hollow, haunted by absence. This was Mama's sewing room, Emma announced, pushing open a door. The room was cozy, with a single bed, a small writing desk, and a large window that promised a breathtaking view when the storm passed. Papa thought you'd like the morning light. It's perfect, Clara said, and she meant it. She could already see herself at that desk, her mind racing, not with sewing patterns, but with crop rotation schedules and soil nutrient charts. She set her bag on the bed, turning to the little girl. Emma, tell me about your father's farm. He grows hay. And oats, Emma said, ticking them off on her fingers. And some vegetables in Mama's old garden. She shrugged, her small shoulders slumping. But nothing grows right anymore. Papa says the soil's tired. Tired soil. The phrase was a diagnosis. Depleted nitrogen, poor aeration, a desperate need for new life. These were problems she knew how to solve. These were the challenges she had lectured on for years, but she wasn't Dr. Whitmore anymore. She was just Clara, the housekeeper. As she stood there, a strange feeling washed over her. This room, Sarah Brennan's sewing room, felt watchful. She ran a hand along the sturdy oak desk. Her fingers brushed against a small, loose piece of wood near the back, a hidden catch. Her heart gave a little thump. With a gentle push, a thin, secret drawer slid open. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal, Sarah's diary. Clara knew she shouldn't. It was an invasion, a violation of this family's grief. But her hand moved as if it had a will of its own. She opened it to the last entry. The handwriting was faint, shaky. The words made the hair on her arms stand up. He doesn't see the poison, it read. It's in the water, it's in the land, it's in him. Clara slammed the journal shut, her heart hammering against her ribs. Poison. What was Sarah talking about? She slid the secret drawer closed just as Thomas's voice echoed from the bottom of the stairs. Miss Whitmore, supper's ready when you are. Her name sounded foreign, a costume she was wearing. Downstairs, she watched Thomas and Emma, trying to see them through Sarah's cryptic warning. Thomas was a good man. She could feel it. A man drowning in grief, but a good man. And Emma was just a child. What poison could possibly be in them? The next morning, the world was reborn in crystal and blue. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt holy. Clara was up before the sun, a habit ingrained from a life of discipline. She found Thomas in the kitchen, feeding logs into the massive iron stove, his back to her. You're an early riser, he said, without turning. Farm life doesn't wait for anyone. She moved to the window, gazing out at the fields. The rising sun was setting the snow on fire, painting it in strokes of gold and rose. Your land is beautiful, Mr. Brennan. It was, he said, and the single word was filled with a universe of pain. 1,200 acres, should be more than enough to provide, should be thriving. Emma said the soil is tired. He finally turned, his face a mask of frustration. Tired, cursed. Take your pick. Nothing I do makes a difference anymore. It's like the land itself is dying. May I ask about your crop rotation? She asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. the voice of a simple housekeeper. He gave a short, bitter laugh. Rotation? I plant hay where hay grows. I plant oats where my father planted oats. It's how it's always been done. The defensiveness in his tone was a wall, but behind it, she heard desperation. This was her moment, her chance to use the knowledge she was hiding. But she had to be careful. Too much, too fast, and he'd see right through her. I grew up on a farm in Iowa, she began, a careful half-truth. I remember my father trying something different once. He planted a field with clover for a whole season, said it was like letting the land rest and eat a good meal. Thomas's eyes narrowed. He was listening. He said the clover roots put the good stuff back into the soil. The next year, his corn grew taller than I'd ever seen it. She held his gaze, willing him to believe the simple farm girl, not the university professor. But I'm just the housekeeper, Mr. Brennan. I'm sure you know your land better than anyone. Thomas, he said, his voice quiet, and you didn't overstep. He looked out the window at the fields that were failing him. Sarah, my wife, she used to say I was too stubborn to see past my own 2 feet. The confession was raw, unexpected. It made him vulnerable, and it made him real. She was the one who understood the land. She had a gift for it. Clara's mind flashed back to the journal. It's in the land. Had Sarah known what was wrong? Had she been trying to fix it? Before Clara could ask, Emma came clattering down the stairs, her face flushed with panic. Papa, the chickens are out again. That old fence broke in the storm. Thomas sighed, the weight of the world settling back onto his shoulders. He reached for his heavy coat. I'll help, Clara said, already grabbing her cloak. You don't need to. I know chickens, she said with a small smile. Trust me. 20 minutes later, in the biting cold, they had the last hen back in the coop. Thomas watched, a strange look on his face, as Clara inspected the broken fence wire. It's the tension, she said, running a gloved finger over the snap. The wire is pulled too tight. When it gets this cold, the metal contracts and it just breaks. You have to leave it a little slack. Give it room to breathe. He crouched down beside her, so close she could feel the heat coming off him, could smell the scent of wood smoke and clean winter air. Show me. Her fingers brushed against his as she showed him how to splice the wire, how to give it just the right amount of play. A jolt, hot and sharp, shot up her arm. She looked up, and he was already watching her, his stormy eyes filled with an intensity that stole her breath. You are full of surprises, Clara Whitmore, he said, his voice a low murmur. She managed a shaky smile, her own secret pounding in her chest like a trapped bird. Everyone has hidden depths, Thomas. His gaze held hers for a moment too long. Then he looked away toward the well near the house. That reminds me, he said, his tone suddenly businesslike. The pump handle's been sticking. I need to take a look at it. Clara's blood ran cold. The well. It's in the water. Sarah's words screamed in her mind. Was this it? Was this the poison? She watched him walk toward the well, every instinct telling her to scream, to stop him. But what could she say? How could she explain a warning from a dead woman's secret diary? She was trapped by her lies and by a danger she couldn't even name. As February bled into a muddy, thawing March, Clara transformed the Brennan Ranch. It started small, hearty meals that brought a healthy blush to Emma's cheeks, mended clothes, and a house that ran with a quiet, humming efficiency. But her real work was done in whispers and subtle suggestions. What if we tried that clover idea in the south pasture? Thomas asked one morning, trying to sound casual. But Clara heard the hope in his voice, fragile as a robin's egg. If what you say is true, it could graze the cattle and heal the field at the same time. It will work, she said, her own excitement hard to contain. It will increase your hay yields by 1/3 next year. I promise. Emma looked up from her breakfast, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Miss Clara, how do you know so much about dirt?" Clara's spoon froze. The directness of the question was a punch to the gut. I read a lot," she stammered. "Agricultural journals, farming almanacs. It's a hobby." "Can you teach me?" Emma pleaded. "About the plants and the soil and everything?" Thomas nodded slowly, a sad smile touching his lips. Sarah always wanted that for Emma. She said a woman needed to be capable, not just ornamental. He looked at Clara. "She would have liked you." The words were a comfort and a knife twist. Sarah, the ghost who walked these halls, the woman who wrote of poison in the water. That afternoon, while Thomas was mending the far fence line, Clara took a bucket and went to the well. Her heart hammered as she worked the creaking pump. The water that gushed out was crystal clear. It smelled clean, earthy. She dipped her fingers in. It was icy cold, pure. There was nothing wrong with it. She felt a wave of relief, followed by confusion. If the water was fine, what had Sarah meant? She carried the bucket back to the house, her mind racing. Maybe it wasn't the drinking water. Maybe it was the groundwater, the creeks that fed the pastures. As she passed the small, withered vegetable garden that had been Sarah's, she noticed something. A patch of earth near the back fence looked different, darker, almost oily. She knelt down, scooping up a handful of the soil. It felt strange, gritty and dead, and it had a faint, chemical smell, something sharp and unnatural that reminded her of the labs back at the college. She looked up, her gaze following the fence line. It ran along a shallow ditch that separated the Brennan property from the ranch next door. The ranch belonging to a man named Silas Kane. Thomas had mentioned him only once, with a deep-seated dislike he didn't bother to hide. Kane's ranch, he'd said, was flourishing. Too much so. While the Brennan land withered, Kane's cattle were fat, and his fields were unnaturally green. It didn't make sense. Unless the poison wasn't coming from inside the Brennan ranch at all. What if it was seeping in from the outside? That evening, a shadow fell across the doorway. It was Silas Kane. He was a big man, with a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He took off his hat, his gaze sliding over Clara in a way that made her skin crawl. "Brennan," he said, his voice smooth as oil, "just checking on my neighbors." "We're fine, Kane," Thomas said, his body tense as a coiled snake. "Just came to see if you'd reconsidered my offer," Kane said, his eyes scanning the cozy kitchen, lingering on the signs of new life, of Clara's presence. "This land is worn out. It's got a sickness. Let me take it off your hands. Give you and the little one a fresh start somewhere else." "Get off my property," Thomas said, his voice dangerously low. Kane just chuckled, a low, nasty sound. "You're a stubborn fool, Brennan, just like your wife was." He put his hat back on, his eyes finding Clara's again, and in them, she saw a flicker of something, recognition. He knew her, not as Clara the housekeeper, but as someone else. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am." Then he was gone. Clara turned to Thomas, her mind reeling. What did he mean? Stubborn like Sarah? Thomas wouldn't meet her eyes. He stared into the fire, his jaw tight. Sarah thought Kane was cheating, using some new chemical fertilizer he got from a traveling salesman. She said it was poison, that it would kill the land in the long run. She was going to prove it. A cold dread seeped into Clara's bones. How? She was taking soil samples, water samples, documenting everything. She had a whole journal full of her findings. The secret journal, the one in her room. It wasn't a diary. It was evidence. "Thomas," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Where did she get sick?" He finally looked at her, his storm cloud eyes filled with a pain so deep it was bottomless. "She collapsed out in the garden, right back there." He gestured toward the window, toward the oily patch of dead soil. Doctor said it was pneumonia. Came on fast, nothing he could do. But it wasn't pneumonia. Clara knew it with a certainty that terrified her. Sarah Brennan hadn't gotten sick. She'd been poisoned, and Silas Kane was the man who had done it. But as she opened her mouth to tell Thomas, to reveal everything she suspected, a new thought, colder and sharper than any before, pierced her mind. Kane had recognized her. How? From where? Then it hit her. The traveling salesman who sold Kane the fertilizer. The men who came from back east, from the big chemical companies. The same circles as the powerful, wealthy family of the man who had ruined her life in Colorado. Dr. Harrison. The man whose company made new, experimental, and very dangerous fertilizers. The scandal, the ranch, the poison. It was all connected. Her past hadn't just followed her here. It had been waiting for her. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture so monstrous Clara could barely breathe. Silas Kane wasn't just a greedy neighbor. He was a pawn. Dr. Harrison, the man who had framed her, the heir to a chemical empire, was the king on this chessboard. He wasn't just trying to silence her. He was using this remote Montana valley as a testing ground for his company's dangerous new product. He'd sell it to a desperate rancher like Kane, who would use it to poison his neighbor's land, forcing a sale. Then Harrison's company could buy the ruined land for pennies on the dollar, strip it of its resources, and move on, leaving a toxic wasteland behind. And Sarah Brennan, a smart, capable woman who loved the land, had figured it out. She wasn't just a threat to Silas Kane, she was a threat to the entire Harrison fortune. Her pneumonia was no accident. It was murder. And now, Clara had stumbled right into the middle of the same deadly game. Kane knew who she was. That flicker of recognition in his eyes wasn't just a guess. He must have seen her picture in a newspaper or a bulletin from the Harrison family, branding her as a fugitive, a woman to be watched. He knew she was Dr. Whitmore, the agricultural scientist who could expose the whole rotten scheme. She was no longer just hiding. She was being hunted. The next few days were a blur of managed terror. Clara went about her duties, cooking, cleaning, teaching Emma, with a calm she didn't feel. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow at the window, sent a jolt of fear through her. She had to tell Thomas. But how? How could she explain that the simple lie she'd told him was tangled up in the death of his wife and the poisoning of his land? He would never trust her again. He would see her not as the woman who had brought his home back to life, but as the harbinger of all this death and deceit. One afternoon, Emma came running inside, her face pale. "Miss Clara, the bad man is back." Clara's heart leaped into her throat. She rushed to the window. It was Silas Kane, riding along the fence line. He wasn't coming to the house. He was just watching. A predator circling his prey. He saw her in the window and smiled, a slow, deliberate spreading of his lips. Then he tipped his hat and rode away. It was a message. "I see you. I know who you are, and I can get to you whenever I want." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She retrieved Sarah's journal from its hiding place. This time, she didn't just read the last page. She read it all. It was a brilliant, meticulous record of a dying ranch. Sarah had documented the declining crop yields, the sick cattle, the strange algae blooms in the creek. She'd tested the soil, just as Clara had, and noted the oily residue and the chemical smell. She had cross-referenced it with articles she'd read in scientific journals, hypothesizing about a new, untested ammonium nitrate compound. She had even confronted Silas Kane, who had laughed in her face. The final entries were filled with a growing fear. "He knows I know," she wrote. "He watches the house. Thomas thinks I'm imagining things. He's too lost in his own grief to see the danger we're in." The words were a gut punch. Thomas hadn't just lost his wife to a sudden illness. He had been blind to her warnings, deaf to her fears. The guilt he carried wasn't just for her death, but for his failure to protect her. Clara knew what she had to do. She had to finish what Sarah had started. She needed proof, hard, undeniable proof that would link Cain, the fertilizer, and Sarah's death. She remembered the oily patch in the garden, the place where Sarah had collapsed. Late that night, with the moon hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, she slipped out of the house with a spade and a glass jar. The air was cold and still. The silence of the ranch was absolute. It felt like she was the only person alive in the world. She knelt in the dead garden, the same spot where Sarah Brennan had drawn her last breath. The chemical smell was stronger here. She dug into the dark, corrupted earth. About 6 inches down, her spade hit something hard, not a rock. It was a small tin box, rusted but intact. With trembling fingers, she pried it open. Inside, nestled in a bit of oilcloth, was a small glass vial filled with a crystalline powder, and a folded piece of paper. It was a sales receipt for a 50-pound bag of Harrison's Miracle Grow, an experimental ammonium nitrate fertilizer, signed by Silas Cain, and dated the week before Sarah died. This was it, the smoking gun. Sarah had gotten a sample of the poison itself and buried it, her final desperate act to leave behind the truth. As Clara stood up, clutching the box, a floorboard creaked on the porch of the main house. A large shadow detached itself from the darkness. It wasn't Thomas. It was Silas Cain. "Looking for something, Doctor?" he sneered, stepping into a sliver of moonlight. He must have been watching the house all night, waiting for her. "I knew you were too smart to be a simple housekeeper. Harrison's people sent word you might head this way, said you had a tendency to stick your nose where it didn't belong." He took a step closer, his large frame blocking her path back to the house. "Give me the box." Clara's mind raced. The house was 100 feet away. Thomas and Emma were sleeping, oblivious. No one could help her. "This is proof you murdered her," Clara said, her voice shaking but clear. Cain laughed. "Proof? That's a receipt for fertilizer. And Sarah Brennan died of pneumonia. Sad story. The whole county felt for poor Thomas." He took another step. "But now he's got you. Another smart woman who asks too many questions. Looks like history's about to repeat itself. A tragic accident. The new housekeeper, wandering out in the night, trips and falls, breaks her neck. Even sadder story." He lunged. Clara reacted on pure instinct. She threw the tin box as hard as she could, not at him, but toward the house. It hit the wooden porch with a loud clatter. Then she screamed, a raw, piercing sound meant to wake the dead. "Thomas!" Cain backhanded her across the face. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain. She stumbled backward, falling into the dead soil of the garden. He was on her in an instant, his heavy hands closing around her throat. Her lungs burned. Black spots danced in her vision. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard a door slam open, a roar of fury that sounded less than human, and then the weight was gone. Thomas had pulled Cain off her, throwing the larger man aside as if he weighed nothing. The two men crashed together in a brutal, silent struggle. Thomas was fueled by years of repressed grief and guilt, a storm of violence finally unleashed. He was no longer a simple rancher. He was a man defending his home, his child, and the woman he was beginning to love, fighting the monster who had destroyed his first family. But as they fought, a new sound cut through the night. The steady, rhythmic beat of approaching horses. Not one rider. Several. Clara scrambled to her feet, her head spinning. In the distance, she could see them. A group of riders approaching at a steady, menacing pace. And in the lead, a man whose face she knew from the faculty meetings at the college. A man she had hoped to never see again. Professor Mitchell. But he wasn't alone, and he wasn't here to bring her back to Colorado. He was here to bury a secret, and her with it. Professor Mitchell reined in his horse, his thin face illuminated by the lanterns his men carried. It was a face of smug, academic cruelty. He looked from the brawling forms of Thomas and Cain to Clara, standing bruised and disheveled in the ruined garden. He didn't look surprised. He looked satisfied, as if he'd arrived just in time for the final act of a play he'd written himself. "Dr. Whitmore," he said, his voice dripping with condescending pity, "always drawn to the most dramatic situations. I see you've made some new, rather rustic acquaintances." Thomas landed a solid punch to Kane's jaw, sending the big man sprawling. He turned to face the riders, his chest heaving, his face a mask of rage and confusion. "Who the hell are you?" "This is a private matter," Mitchell said, ignoring him and fixing his gaze on Clara. "The college has sent me to retrieve you. Your behavior has been a disgrace." "The college?" Clara spat, tasting blood. "You're a long way from Colorado, Professor, and you're lying. The college wouldn't send a pack of armed men." Mitchell's thin smile widened. "Very astute, Doctor. No, the college has washed its hands of you. I'm here on behalf of a more concerned party, the Harrison family. They were very interested to hear from Mr. Kane that you had found your way here. They feel a certain responsibility for you. They want to make sure you don't cause any more trouble." The threat was clear. These weren't academics. They were fixers. Hired guns sent to clean up a mess. Silas Kane staggered to his feet, wiping blood from his lip. "Took you long enough, Mitchell. She found the box, the proof." Mitchell's eyes flickered toward the tin box lying on the porch. Did she now? How unfortunate. For her. He dismounted, walking slowly toward the porch. "It seems we'll have to be more thorough this time. A fire, a tragic accident. The whole ranch, gone. Brennan and his daughter, caught in the flames with the troublesome housekeeper. A clean slate." Thomas stepped in front of Clara, shielding her with his body. The pieces were finally coming together for him, the full, horrifying scope of the conspiracy that had shattered his life. You killed her," he whispered, his voice choked with a terrible, dawning realization. He looked at Kane. "My Sarah. You poisoned her." "She was a problem," Kane grunted, "just like this one." "And now," Mitchell said, picking up the tin box, "the problem will be solved for good." He gestured to his men. "Burn it. Burn it all down." The men dismounted, carrying torches that flared to life, casting dancing, demonic shadows across the yard. This was it. The end of the line. Trapped between a murderer and a squad of corporate assassins. But as the men advanced, a small voice cut through the tension. "Papa?" Emma stood in the open doorway, her small face a ghostly white in the torchlight, clutching a heavy rifle in her hands. It was Sarah's old hunting rifle. Thomas had taught her to shoot, to respect the weapon, to never ever point it at a person. But she was pointing it now, her small arms trembling under the weight, the barrel aimed squarely at Professor Mitchell. "You leave my papa alone," she said, her voice small but steady. Mitchell actually laughed. "And what is a little girl going to do with a big gun?" "She's going to do what I taught her," Thomas said, his voice deadly calm. He never took his eyes off Mitchell. "She's going to protect her home." In that split second of distraction, Thomas moved. He launched himself not at Mitchell, but at the closest man with a torch, tackling him to the ground. Clara didn't hesitate. She scooped up the heavy spade she'd been digging with and swung it with all her might at another man's knees. He howled and crumpled. The yard exploded into chaos. The hired guns were caught off guard, not expecting a fight from a grieving rancher and a woman they'd dismissed as a housekeeper. Emma stood her ground on the porch, the rifle still trained on Mitchell, her presence a strange, terrifying anchor in the swirling violence. Silas Kane saw his chance. While Thomas and Clara were occupied, he scrambled for the dropped torch, his eyes wild with hate. He was going to burn the house, with Emma in it. "Emma, look out!" Clara screamed, but Emma wasn't looking at Kane. She was looking at Mitchell, who was pulling a small pistol from his coat. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Mitchell raising his pistol toward Thomas. Kane raising the torch toward the house. Emma small and fierce, standing between them all. A deafening boom echoed through the valley as the rifle went off. Not from Emma's gun, from the darkness beyond the ring of torchlight. Professor Mitchell cried out and staggered back, clutching his shoulder, his pistol clattering to the ground. One of the other hired guns spun around, hit in the chest, and fell without a sound. Out of the darkness, figures emerged. Dozens of them. Ranchers, Thomas's neighbors, men he'd known his whole life. They appeared from the shadows, from behind the barn, from the cover of the pines, carrying their own rifles and shotguns. They had heard the commotion, the scream, the fighting. In the Montana Territory, you didn't wait for the law. You were the law. The hired guns froze, suddenly finding themselves outnumbered and outgunned. The fight was over. Silas Kane dropped the torch as if it had burned him. He raised his hands in surrender, his face a mask of disbelief. Mitchell, clutching his bleeding shoulder, stared at the ring of grim-faced ranchers, his academic arrogance dissolving into pure, pathetic fear. The neighbors formed a silent circle around the intruders. One of them, a grizzled old man named Jed, stepped forward and nudged Kane with the barrel of his rifle. "Looks like you picked the wrong ranch to bother, Silas." Thomas walked over to Emma, gently taking the heavy rifle from her hands. He knelt and pulled her into a fierce hug, burying his face in her hair. "You were so brave," he whispered. "So brave." Clara watched them, her heart feeling like it was going to break open. She looked at the faces of the men who had come to their rescue. They weren't just neighbors. They were a community, something she had never really had. She had come here to hide, to be alone. But in this violent, terrible night, she had found a family, a home. Thomas looked up from Emma, his eyes finding Clara's across the chaotic yard. The anger was gone. The hurt was gone. All that was left was a raw, shining love. He had seen all of her secrets, all of her lies, all of her strength. And he was still there. As the neighbors tied up Kane, Mitchell, and the remaining hired guns, Thomas walked over to Clara. He gently touched the bruise on her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "Doctor, professor, housekeeper," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't care what they call you." He took her hands in his. "All I care about is that you're here, that you're safe." Tears she didn't know she had left began to stream down her face, tears of relief, of exhaustion, of a joy so profound it was painful. "I love you, Thomas Brennan," she whispered. "I love you too, Clara Whitmore," he said, and he leaned in and kissed her, right there in the middle of the ruined garden, surrounded by the wreckage of their past and the silent, watchful promise of their future. 3 months later, the sun shone down on a wedding. Clara stood on the porch of the ranch house, the same porch where the tin box of evidence had landed, and married Thomas Brennan. Emma, in a yellow dress Clara had sewn, stood beside her as her maid of honor, beaming. The whole county was there. The same neighbors who had stood with them in the darkness now stood with them in the light. Silas Kane and Mitchell were in prison, awaiting a trial that was a foregone conclusion. The testimony of an entire community, combined with Sarah Brennan's meticulous journal and the evidence from the tin box, had brought the Harrison chemical empire to its knees. Their dangerous products were exposed, their conspiracy laid bare. Justice, slow but relentless, was being served. Later, as the party celebrated on the lawn, Emma tugged on Clara's dress. "Mama Clara," she said, the new name sounding as natural as breathing. "When can we start healing the garden?" Clara smiled, her heart full. "We can start tomorrow, sweetheart. First, we have to pull out all the poison. Then we have to feed the soil, make it strong again. We'll plant clover and beans and all the things that put the goodness back." "Like companion planting?" Emma asked, remembering a long-ago lesson. "Exactly," Clara said, looking over at Thomas, who was laughing with his friends. Some things just grow better together. Thomas caught her eye and walked over, slipping his arm around her waist. "Mrs. Brennan," he murmured in her ear, "you look like a woman with a plan." "I am, Mr. Brennan," she said, leaning into his strength. "I have a 5-year plan for crop rotation, a 10-year plan for soil rejuvenation, and a lifelong plan for this family." He kissed her, a long, sweet promise under the vast Montana sky. She had come to this place running from her past, a woman with a secret identity and a shattered life. She had found a poisoned land, a grieving family, and a darkness that threatened to consume them all. But together, they had faced the storm. They had dug up the poison and let the truth see the light. The seeds they were planting now weren't just in the fields. They were seeds of hope, of healing, and of a love as stubborn and resilient as the land itself. The harvest, she knew, would be beautiful. If you enjoyed this story of justice and new beginnings, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You never know what secrets are buried just beneath the surface.